2008. In the quiet suburb of Falls Church, Virginia, Dorian Leigh sits at her writing desk, surrounded by decades of magazine clippings that chronicle a revolution she engineered with nothing but intelligence, ambition, and an understanding that beauty could be mathematics. The face gazing back from those yellowed covers, angular cheekbones catching light like architectural blueprints, eyes that could calculate desire with scientific precision, belongs to the woman who taught America that wanting something could be more powerful than having it. At 91, Dorian Leigh Parker is putting the finishing touches on her memoirs. Her fingers still steady as she types the story of how a 27-year-old aeronautical engineer became one of the first women to define what a supermodel could be. The apartment where she lives alone is both museum and laboratory, filled with evidence of a career that transformed not just fashion but the entire science of selling dreams to strangers. This is Dorian Leigh in her final act, the woman who had proven that modeling could be an intellectual exercise, that the right combination of brains and beauty could reshape entire industries, and that understanding psychology was more valuable than perfect bone structure. But she had also discovered that being the architect of your own image meant living inside that image until the blueprint became indistinguishable from the person who had drawn it. The silence in that Virginia apartment was filled with the distant echoes of camera shutters and studio lights, the ghostly sounds of a revolution that had moved on without its founding mother while continuing to profit from the formulas she had invented. The woman who had made modeling into applied psychology was writing her final chapter, but her influence on beauty marketing and consumer desire would outlive her by generations. This wasn't just another story of fame and decline. This was the biography of the woman who had discovered that desire could be engineered, that aspiration could be mass-produced, and that the right image could make millions of people want to become someone they had never imagined being. But creating that power had required sacrificing the privacy and authenticity that made life worth living, turning her into both the beneficiary and the victim of her own innovations. Was this really just the natural end of a long life, or was something more complex at work? In Dorian's case, the complexity wasn't mysterious. It was the inevitable result of building a career on solving problems that couldn't be solved, of using scientific thinking to understand emotional needs that defied rational analysis, and of discovering that the very success she had engineered contained the seeds of its own obsolescence. But to understand how a brilliant engineer became the woman who taught America what it wanted to look like, how someone who started too late revolutionized an industry built on youth, and how a mind trained in mathematics transformed the emotional landscape of an entire culture, we must first understand how it all began. April 23, 1917. Dorian Elizabeth Leigh was born in San Antonio, Texas, into a family where solving problems was valued more than following fashion, where intelligence was prized above appearance, and where a daughter was expected to use her mind for something more substantial than choosing the right lipstick. Her father believed in education and hard work. Her mother understood the power of presentation, and their daughter inherited both the analytical precision of an engineer and the intuitive understanding of human psychology that would later make her fortune. From her earliest memories, Dorian understood that she was different from other girls in ways that both excited and isolated her. While her classmates were learning to be decorative, she was fascinated by systems, not just mechanical ones, but the invisible networks of cause and effect that made people want things, choose things, become things they hadn't been before. The decision to study at George Washington University and work as a draftswoman for Republic Aviation during World War II wasn't just unusual for a woman in the 1940s. It was preparation for a career that didn't yet exist. Dorian was learning to think like an engineer while developing the precision and professionalism that would later set her apart in an industry where most participants were hired for their looks rather than their minds. But the war years also taught Dorian something crucial about the relationship between function and beauty that would define her approach to modeling. Working in aircraft design, she learned that the most beautiful solutions were often the most efficient ones, that form followed function in ways that could be both practical and aesthetically pleasing. This understanding would later revolutionize how she approached posing, lighting, and the entire science of creating images that were both visually striking and psychologically effective. The transition from engineer to model happened almost by accident in 1944, when a photographer noticed not just her appearance but her poise and intelligence, qualities that were rare in a modeling world where beauty was usually considered sufficient qualification for success. But what made the transition possible was Dorian's engineer's mind, her ability to analyze what made photographs work and then systematically reproduce those effects. At 27, Dorian was entering modeling at an age when most women were considered past their professional prime, but her maturity and sophistication were exactly what post-war America needed. The country was emerging from years of rationing and practicality into an era of abundance and choice, and consumers wanted models who looked like they understood the difference between necessity and luxury, between making do and choosing the best. The breakthrough came at Harper's Bazaar, where editor Carmel Snow and art director Alexei Brodovich recognized that Dorian represented something unprecedented. A model who could think about what she was doing while she was doing it, who could analyze the psychology of an image and adjust her performance accordingly. Brodovich's layout sessions became masterclasses in applied psychology, with Dorian learning to calculate angles, predict emotional responses, and engineer desire through systematic manipulation of light, expression, and gesture. The smoke-filled layout room at Harper's Bazaar became Dorian's second laboratory. While other models simply followed directions, she studied the mechanics of persuasion, understanding that each photograph was a problem to be solved rather than just a moment to be captured. When Brodovich would point to a contact sheet and say, "Again," Dorian didn't just repeat her pose, she analyzed what hadn't worked and systematically corrected it. This analytical approach was revolutionary in an industry that treated modeling as intuitive performance rather than learned skill. Dorian was proving that the most effective images came from understanding rather than accident, that beauty could be engineered rather than simply photographed, and that intelligence could be as marketable as conventional attractiveness. But success at Harper's Bazaar also introduced Dorian to the first contradictions of her new career. The very intelligence that made her photographs so compelling also made her increasingly aware of the industry's limitations, its tendency to reduce women to their appearance while profiting from their ability to project complex emotions and psychological states. The contract with Revlon in 1952 that made her the face of the Fire and Ice campaign wasn't just a modeling assignment. It was the moment when Dorian became the first woman to demonstrate that a model could transcend fashion and become a psychological phenomenon. The campaign was revolutionary not just for its visual impact but for its marketing strategy, which positioned beauty as intelligence and purchasing as self-discovery. The meeting in Charles Revson's office where the campaign was conceived revealed the kind of strategic thinking that set Dorian apart from other models. While Revson focused on the visual elements, the red dress, the dramatic lighting, the bold typography, copywriter Kay Daly was developing the psychological questionnaire that would transform buying lipstick into an act of self-definition. But it was Dorian who understood how to make the connection between image and psychology credible, how to embody both sophistication and accessibility in ways that made ordinary women feel that transformation was possible. Are you made for fire and ice? The questionnaire was brilliant consumer psychology, but it worked only because Dorian could convince viewers that the confidence and sophistication she projected were achievable rather than impossible. She was selling not just cosmetics, but the idea that intelligence could be beautiful, that independence could be attractive, and that the right products could help women become the kind of people who lived without apologies. The famous photograph, Dorian in a red evening gown, one eyebrow raised, expression both challenging and inviting, became iconic because it captured something that had never been marketed before. The idea that beauty and brains weren't mutually exclusive, that wanting to be desired and wanting to be respected could be the same thing. But the success of Fire and Ice also created the template for pressures that would define the rest of Dorian's career. Suddenly, she wasn't just a model. She was a brand, a symbol, a set of ideas about femininity and power that had to be maintained and protected. The image she had engineered was so successful that it began to eclipse the person who had created it. Behind all that calculated perfection, was there an unbearable pressure that nobody could see? The answer was hidden in the increasingly complex arrangements of her personal life, where relationships had to navigate the demands of maintaining an image that was simultaneously personal and commercial. The marriage to Roger Mela had provided stability during her early career, but as her fame grew, the gap between her private needs and her public responsibilities became harder to bridge. The affair with playwright Mark Blitzstein revealed both Dorian's hunger for intellectual connection and the complications that came from being involved with someone who valued her mind as much as her appearance. But the relationship also demonstrated how difficult it was to maintain authentic intimacy when your private life was constantly being evaluated for its impact on your public image. Each subsequent marriage represented another attempt to find someone who could understand both her professional success and her personal complexity. But each relationship also ended in the kind of public disappointment that made her increasingly wary of emotional vulnerability. Fame was making authentic connection almost impossible, creating barriers between her true self and the people who claimed to love her. The professional rivalry with her younger sister Suzy Parker that developed during the 1950s wasn't just family drama. It was a media-manufactured competition that revealed how the fashion industry profited from forcing women to compete against each other. While both sisters were successful, the narrative that emerged positioned Dorian as the sophisticated older sister whose time was passing and Suzy as the fresh young face who represented the future. This manufactured rivalry was devastating for both women, reducing them to caricatures that served the industry's need for compelling storylines while making their actual relationship secondary to their commercial value. The competition that magazines and advertisers found so profitable was tearing apart a family, proving that the fashion industry's appetite for drama extended even to the most personal relationships. Did this family competition mark the beginning of Dorian's decline? Or was it simply the most visible symptom of deeper structural problems in an industry that treated women as interchangeable commodities? The answer lay in understanding that modeling success in the 1950s was inherently temporary, built on qualities that time would inevitably erode and market forces that prioritized novelty over experience. But Dorian's response to these limitations revealed both her intelligence and her determination to remain relevant in an industry that was designed to discard its participants. The modeling agency she founded in Paris during the late 1950s was both business venture and statement of principles. An attempt to create more humane working conditions for models while using her industry knowledge to protect other women from the exploitative practices she had experienced. But it was also a way for Dorian to remain connected to the fashion world while accepting that her own career as a primary attraction was ending. The late-night phone calls from young models who were struggling with the same pressures she had faced became a different kind of performance, one where Dorian used her intelligence and experience to solve problems that had nothing to do with how she looked. Beauty is a profession, not a debt you pay with your life, she would tell them, trying to pass on lessons that had cost her decades to learn. The move to Europe represented both escape and exile, escape from American media attention that had become fixated on her personal problems rather than her professional achievements, but also exile from the country where she had created her greatest successes. Paris offered sophistication and artistic credibility, but it also meant starting over in a market where her American fame was less valuable and her age was more apparent. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their most successful moments? For Dorian, the answer was clearly no. Every business venture, every attempt to reinvent herself, every new relationship was measured against the Fire and Ice campaign and found wanting. She had created something so culturally powerful that it became both her greatest achievement and the standard against which everything else in her life was judged. The financial struggles that began during the 1960s weren't just the result of poor business decisions. They were the inevitable consequence of building a lifestyle around income that depended on qualities that time would erode. The fees she had commanded during her modeling peak had supported a level of spending that assumed success would continue indefinitely. But the industry had moved on to younger faces while she was still trying to maintain the same standard of living. The attempts to transition into business and writing revealed both her intelligence and her discovery that the skills that had made her a successful model weren't necessarily transferable to other fields. The ability to project confidence, to read people quickly, to adapt to different situations. These were valuable but not sufficient for building sustainable post-modeling careers in industries that operated according to different rules. Were these later years acts of surrender or courageous acts of adaptation? The answer depended on whether you saw Dorian's struggles as personal failures or as the inevitable result of participating in an industry that was structurally designed to consume and discard its participants. She was fighting battles that couldn't be won. Against aging, against changing beauty standards, against economic systems that had no place for former models who were no longer marketable. But there was also something admirable about her refusal to disappear quietly. Her insistence on continuing to work and create even when those efforts were largely unsuccessful. The agency work, the writing projects, the various business ventures, all represented Dorian's determination to remain productive rather than simply living off past achievements. The autobiography she completed during her final years represented both a summation of her experiences and an attempt to control the narrative of her own life, to ensure that her story would be told from her perspective rather than reconstructed by others who had known only her public image. The book was her final modeling assignment, presenting herself to the world exactly as she wanted to be remembered. July 7th, 2008. Dorian Leigh died peacefully in Falls Church, Virginia. Her mind still sharp enough to understand that she was witnessing the end of a story that had begun in Texas aircraft hangars and transformed the way the world thought about beauty, desire, and the relationship between intelligence and attraction. The immediate response to her death revealed both the lasting impact of her innovations and the fashion industry's tendency to remember its pioneers as symbols rather than complete human beings. The obituaries that appeared in major newspapers focused primarily on the Fire and Ice campaign and her role as one of the first women to define what supermodel status could mean, but they often overlooked the complexity of her later years and the questions her career raised about sustainability, authenticity, and the personal costs of commercial success. The estate she left behind was modest, consisting primarily of photographs, documents, and licensing rights that would continue to generate income while providing evidence of her lasting influence on beauty marketing and consumer psychology. Her most valuable legacy wasn't financial but conceptual. The understanding that modeling could be intellectual work, that beauty could be strategic, and that the most powerful images came from understanding rather than accident. Was her death as straightforward as reported, or were powerful hidden forces involved? In Dorian's case, the powerful forces were economic and cultural rather than conspiratorial. an industry that extracted maximum value from its participants while providing minimal long-term security, a society that confused commercial visibility with personal worth, and an economic system that discarded people when their marketability declined while continuing to profit from their innovations. Her influence on subsequent generations of models was profound but often unacknowledged. The idea that models could be celebrities in their own right, that they could command creative control, that they could transition into business careers, all of these possibilities had been established by Dorian's example, even though later practitioners often achieved these goals more successfully than she had. The broader cultural impact of her story highlighted the relationship between intelligence, beauty, and commercial success in ways that remain relevant for anyone trying to build a career based on personal brand or public image. Dorian's life raised questions about sustainability, authenticity, and the hidden costs of living as a symbol rather than simply as a person. In the years following her death, fashion historians and marketing experts recognized her role in establishing many of the conventions that continue to define beauty advertising and celebrity culture. The techniques she had pioneered for projecting personality through still images became the foundation for much of contemporary social media and influencer marketing. But her story also revealed darker truths about the psychological costs of living as a carefully constructed image. The transformation from Dorian Leigh the person to Dorian Leigh the brand had been so gradual that even she hadn't noticed when the performance became permanent. By the height of her fame, there were days when she would catch herself calculating the emotional impact of her expressions even in private moments, when she would automatically adjust her posture when walking through her own apartment, when the analytical mind that had made her successful would turn inward and begin analyzing her own authenticity as if it were another marketing problem to solve. The letters she wrote to friends during the 1960s revealed a woman struggling with questions that had no clear answers. How do you maintain a sense of self when your identity has become a commercial product? How do you form genuine relationships when everyone who approaches you has been influenced by images you've carefully constructed? How do you age gracefully when your entire career has been built on the premise that your value is tied to your appearance and the cultural associations people have with that appearance? These weren't just philosophical concerns. They were practical problems that affected every aspect of her daily life. The simple act of grocery shopping became complicated when other customers recognized her and expected her to embody the confidence and sophistication she projected in advertisements. The difficulty of maintaining friendships with people who had known her before she became famous was compounded by her own uncertainty about which version of herself was authentic and which was performance. The drinking that became more noticeable during her later years wasn't just a response to professional disappointments. It was a form of self-medication for the existential confusion that came from having spent decades being professionally rewarded for projecting versions of herself that bore increasingly little resemblance to her private thoughts and feelings. Alcohol provided temporary relief from the exhausting process of constant self-monitoring and image management that had become second nature during her peak years. But perhaps most troubling was the way her analytical intelligence, which had been her greatest asset during her modeling career, began to work against her personal happiness. She found herself unable to experience emotions without simultaneously analyzing their commercial potential, unable to form relationships without calculating their impact on her public image, unable to make life choices without considering their effect on her brand value. The modeling agency work in Paris during the 1960s and 1970s represented both her attempt to find meaning beyond her own image and her discovery that even helping other women navigate the industry couldn't completely satisfy her need for authentic purpose. While she was genuinely committed to creating better working conditions for models and protecting young women from the exploitation she had experienced, she was also aware that her motivation for this work was partly an attempt to retroactively justify the costs of her own career. The conversations she had with young models who sought her guidance revealed the evolution of an industry that had learned to exploit psychological vulnerabilities more systematically than it had during her own career. Where Dorian had navigated the tension between intelligence and beauty largely on her own, the models of the 1960s and 1970s were facing more organized pressure to maintain impossible standards of perfection while dealing with increasingly sophisticated forms of manipulation by photographers, agencies, and advertisers. Her attempts to protect these women from making the same mistakes she had made were complicated by her recognition that the industry had changed in ways that made her experience less relevant as a guide. The problems were fundamentally the same: the confusion of commercial value with personal worth, the difficulty of maintaining authentic relationships while living as a public image, the challenge of aging in a profession that worshipped youth. But the specific forms these problems took were evolving faster than anyone could develop effective solutions. The financial struggles that defined much of her later life weren't just about money. They were about the discovery that the skills and knowledge that had made her valuable during her peak years weren't easily transferable to other contexts. The psychological sophistication that had made her modeling revolutionary was useful primarily within the fashion and advertising industries, and those industries were increasingly focused on younger faces and newer approaches to image making. What hidden secrets might still remain untold behind her public image? The biggest secret may be the simplest one: that behind all the sophistication and strategic thinking was a woman who had approached modeling like the engineering problem it actually was, who had used mathematical precision to understand emotional needs, and who had spent her career proving that intelligence could be as marketable as conventional beauty. But there was a deeper secret that Dorian herself may not have fully understood until her final years: that the very success of her approach to modeling had created a template that could be used to manipulate women's insecurities more effectively than ever before. The psychological insights she had developed to make herself more marketable had been absorbed by an industry that was learning to use those same insights to create more sophisticated forms of exploitation. The Fire and Ice campaign that had made her famous had demonstrated that women could be sold not just products but identities, not just cosmetics but psychological transformations. But the techniques that had made that campaign effective, the careful analysis of female desire, the strategic use of aspiration and insecurity, the transformation of purchasing into a form of self-definition, had been refined and weaponized by subsequent generations of marketers who understood Dorian's innovations better than she had understood their implications. The questionnaire that had seemed so clever and empowering in 1952, "Are you made for fire and ice?" had spawned decades of increasingly invasive psychological profiling designed to identify and exploit women's vulnerabilities with scientific precision. The industry that Dorian had helped create was using her own innovations to manufacture insecurities that could only be resolved through consumption, creating a cycle of desire and disappointment that enriched corporations while impoverishing the emotional lives of the women who bought their products. This recognition, which came gradually during her later years, created a form of guilt that was difficult to process or resolve. Dorian had genuinely believed that she was empowering women by showing them that intelligence and beauty could coexist, that confidence could be cultivated, that the right approach to self-presentation could open doors and create opportunities. But she was also becoming aware that her work had been used to create more sophisticated forms of the same limitations she had tried to transcend. The memoirs she wrote during her final years were partly an attempt to reclaim control over her narrative, but they were also a form of confession, an acknowledgement that good intentions and individual success couldn't protect against the systemic problems that made the fashion and beauty industries fundamentally exploitative. She had succeeded within a system that was designed to consume the people who made it profitable, and her success had helped that system become more effective at consumption. The loneliness that defined much of her later life wasn't just the result of aging or financial problems. It was the consequence of having spent decades perfecting an image that made genuine intimacy almost impossible. The very qualities that had made her professionally successful. The analytical detachment, the strategic thinking, the ability to project confidence while hiding vulnerability, had also made it difficult for people to know who she really was beneath the carefully constructed persona. Friends who had known her during different phases of her career often described feeling like they had known several different women, each authentic in her own way, but none representing the complete truth of who Dorian Leigh actually was. This fragmentation wasn't the result of deliberate deception, but rather the inevitable consequence of having spent so many years being professionally rewarded for emphasizing different aspects of her personality, depending on what various audiences needed from her. The phone calls she made during her final years to old colleagues and acquaintances weren't just about loneliness. They were attempts to reconstruct a coherent sense of self from the fragments of identity she had scattered across decades of professional performance. Each conversation was an archaeological expedition into her own past, an attempt to remember who she had been before she became what the world wanted her to be. The fashion industry gradually developed better support systems for aging models and more sustainable career paths for women whose appeal extended beyond their peak years, though Dorian's story remained both inspiration and cautionary tale. She had shown what was possible when beauty was combined with brains. But she had also revealed the personal costs of building identity around commercial success. As understanding of the modeling industry's psychological pressures improved, Dorian's career was recognized as an example of what could be achieved when intelligence was applied to image making, but also as a warning about the importance of building self-worth on foundations more stable than public recognition and market value. The ultimate question that Dorian's life raised, whether beauty and fashion industries could provide sustainable fulfillment for their smartest participants, or whether they were designed to consume the people who made them profitable, remained unanswered but continued to resonate with anyone navigating the relationship between personal authenticity and commercial success. They said she was just beautiful. She replied, "I was interesting." Ugh, they hired a face. She brought an engineer's brain into the frame. Magazines, cosmetics companies, and the entire world learned to sell aspiration from the images she constructed. By the end, the lights dimmed faster than expected, but the formulas for desire she had created continued operating in an age of social media. Want could be shaped, identity could be edited. Revlon might change slogans, runways might rebuild, but Dorian Leigh's lesson endured. Beauty is a language. And when a woman learns to write literature with her own face, that too is intelligence. The game made her pay prices. History returned the credit. People once celebrated fire and ice. Today we understand that between fire and ice, she had chosen to become the designer of temperature. The woman who had proclaimed, "I wasn't beautiful, I was interesting," that was enough, had proven that in a world obsessed with conventional perfection, being interesting could be more valuable than being flawless, that intelligence could be more marketable than mere attractiveness, and that the most enduring successes came from understanding the difference between what people said they wanted and what they actually needed to feel about themselves. Dorian Leigh had been one of the first to define supermodel status, but more importantly, she had been the first woman to prove that modeling could be applied psychology, that fashion could be strategic communication, and that the right combination of analytical thinking and intuitive understanding could reshape how an entire culture thought about beauty, desire, and the relationship between appearance and intelligence.